Let's get to what increasingly is clear, what Israel actually wants to do with regards to Gaza and the Palestinians who live in Gaza. Put this up on the screen. They have been quietly pushing for Egypt to admit large numbers of Gazans. Let me go ahead and read a little bit from this report. They say they've been trying to build international support in recent weeks for the transfer of several 100,000 civilians from Gaza to Egypt for the duration of its war in the territory. Israeli leaders and diplomats have privately proposed the idea to several foreign governments, framing it as a humanitarian initiative that would allow civilians to temporarily escape the perils of Gaza for refugee camps in the Sinai Desert just across the border neighboring Egypt. The suggestion was dismissed by most of Israel's interlocutors, who include the U.S. and Britain, because of the risk that such a mass displacement could become permanent. Some Israeli hardliners advocate keeping control of Gaza and permanently expelling its Palestinian residents. A Likud lawmaker has called for another Nakba that would, quote, overshadow the original mass displacement in 1948. Here's the quote from that Likud lawmaker. Right now, one goal, Nakba. Nakba in Gaza and Nakba to anyone who dares to join. Another far-right government minister said on Wednesday that Gazan land should be given to former Israeli soldiers who fought in Gaza or to former Israeli settlers who lived in the enclave before Israel withdrew in 2005. Video has also emerged of an Israeli military officer calling for Israel to reoccupy Gaza, as well as a separate video that shows a pop singer calling for that reoccupation, prompting the approval of an audience of soldiers. So they have been pushing, working behind the scenes, to try to convince Egypt, hey, just take a few 100,000 of these Gaza residents just for the duration of the war. Pinky promise, we're totally going to take them back. Meanwhile, their own government and affiliated think tanks are laying out proposals for the permanent removal of Palestinians from Gaza, which would be an ethnic cleansing, like very clear textbook by the definition. And so it's very hard for anyone to believe that this evacuation would truly be temporary. Certainly the Palestinians don't believe it. The Egyptians don't believe it. The Jordanians don't believe it. Even we don't. Even our dumbasses don't believe it. So in terms of the United States government and Tony Blinken. So this is, becoming pretty clear that this is what they're pushing for behind the scenes. And Saagar, in that report that came out, which there was some suggestion that it was sort of intentionally leaked as like a trial balloon, they even talked about how they would overcome this type of initial opposition. And it's like basically you create facts on the ground, where you have such a humanitarian catastrophe, which is already unfolding. You have now residents of Gaza who are living on 2 pieces of bread coming basically from the UN a day. Water is extremely scarce, no fuel. I mean, you guys know the horror that is unfolding there. So you create such a humanitarian catastrophe that it creates all this pressure on Egypt in particular to take people in. You already see them taking in some to a field hospital, very small numbers at this point. And you make it so that there really is no feasible alternative. Like, what is the feasible alternative? So I think that's the direction that they continue to push on, both in terms of their private negotiations and in terms of these public trial balloons. And, in terms of very clear statements from, these aren't fringe people who are saying openly, hey, let's call for the Nakba. These are members of the governing party.
Yeah, this is where I think that the U.S. power actually could be the most exerted, where they're going to Israel and they're like, this is a red line. They're like, if there's any discussion of this in the official government, you're nuking it. It's not happening. That's where conditional aid is. Same thing for Egypt. They're like, we're going to set up a safe zone. Not a single person has to be worrying about ethnic cleansing. Everybody's going to be able to return. We can have some sort of military operation. We can negotiate the battle space, the military objective, and all of that. And that is how we keep a cap on a major regional war. Instead, we're not doing any of that. And I would point actually to that shocking comment that came from Egypt 5 days ago, which is starting to make a hell of a lot more sense when he said, quote, we are ready to sacrifice millions of lives to ensure that no one encroaches upon our territory. That was the prime minister of Egypt. And It was said with, look, Sisi didn't say it. but he definitely was ordered to say it, or it was conditioned, and it was greenlit by the Egyptian government. And at the time, there were some eyebrows. Then we started seeing inklings about Israeli plans and all that. But now it seems that this was, actually asked and pushed for behind the scenes to the Egyptians, and explains initially also why Sisi so rejected Anthony Blinken in that initial October 8 and October 9 visit, when Blinken was like, hey, maybe we open up the Sinai. And Sisi was like, absolutely not. Hell no, I'm not doing it. At the time, even people can probably go look. I was like, I don't know why they're not doing this. Now it all starts to make a lot more sense. And it's because also, again, we can allay these fears. We can tell the Israelis, we're like, this is not going to happen. Period. End of story. Never. We will never live with this. This is a red line for U.S. policy. If it's even openly discussed, then aid and all that is not going to happen. But, in this environment, which is basically a vacuum of the Israelis get to do basically what they want, and then the Egyptians, I don't even know if we have proper relations at this point. Can the President Biden can even get Sisi on the phone? Maybe they're not going to believe a word that we say. So the trust deficit is actually making things way more unstable in the region. And that's, again, the prospect for regional war increases on behalf of that.
I also just have to comment on, I guess, what you would call a historical irony of the Jewish-Israeli government trying to push a stateless people to wander in the Sinai Egyptian desert indefinitely. Like I said, I think you might call that a historic irony. To speak to some more of the just, utterly extreme genocidal, open, advocation, that's not a word. Anyway, advocacy for ethnic cleansing coming out of the Israeli government, our great allies, who we have drawn zero red lines for, made it really clear we're not drawing any red lines. Go ahead and put this up on the screen. This was from Bezalel Smotrich, who is the Israeli finance minister, so he's a cabinet minister. He said on Israeli TV, quote, I don't see a big difference between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, of course, in charge of the West Bank. The Arabs are the same Arabs. Okay, so this puts into context what has been going on in the West Bank that we broke down for you last week, and Counterpoints also covered extensively. Massive escalation in violence in the West Bank. Jewish settlers aided in a majority of the cases directly by the IDF, pushing Palestinians off of their land, killing over 100 just in the time period post October 7th. So while this war has been being waged on Gaza, you have over 100 Palestinians in the West Bank being murdered there as well. So he's laying out the groundwork here for, hey, Hamas is not just Gaza. We see the West Bank. We see the people who run the West Bank as being basically the same as Hamas. The, quote, Arabs are the same Arabs. So it gives you insight into the thinking of some of the coalition partners and one particular cabinet minister in the Netanyahu government. And Saagar, this is what we mean when we say this is the most extreme government that Israel has ever had in their history. And just to add one more that I referred to before, go ahead and put this up on the screen. Another far-right minister saying that, quote, nuking Gaza is an option. Population should, quote, go to Ireland or the deserts. This was in an interview, a local interview, where this minister he's the heritage minister, was suggesting that some kind of nuclear bomb could be dropped on Gaza. He was asked the question, whether this would be a good idea, and he said, quote, that's one way. He also voiced his objection during the interview to allow any humanitarian aid into Gaza, saying, quote, we wouldn't hand the Nazis humanitarian aid, and charging that there is no such thing as uninvolved civilians in Gaza. This is exactly the type of dehumanizing rhetoric that throughout history has been used to justify genocide. Because if there are no uninvolved citizens, there are no innocent civilians, then, hey, no problem to just wipe them all off the map. He goes even further. He backs retaking the Strip's territory and restoring the settlements there. Asked about the fate of the Palestinian population, he says, quote, they can go to Ireland or deserts. The monsters in Gaza should find a solution by themselves. He says the Northern Strip has no right to exist, adding that anyone waving a Palestinian or Hamas flag should not continue living on the face of the earth. This is a government minister who is saying these things and who, again, we have said no red lines, no matter what, do what you want to do.
Yeah, again, I can't help but come back to the way that we are apparently just we're not talking to Netanyahu about this, or they're not listening, or a little bit of both. In every respect, I mean, none of this is helpful in any way. It's also funny, I think we were talking about this, Krystal, one of the reasons he got in trouble, this minister, is for admitting that Israel has nuclear weapons,
right?
Right, which they're not supposed to admit, even though they obviously do. You should also go look. I was talking a little bit about spying and stealing technology from the U.S. You should go look into the history of how they acquired those U.S. weapons, or those nuclear weapons. Very, very interesting for behavior for an ally. But that's something that we could put aside. The point, I think, just for all of this is that the open calls within Israel are bolstering the worst claims of Hamas and of Palestinians, giving them the power to, enforce their ideology and their governance by being like, we're protecting you against these. It's also inflaming the tensions of our allied Arab and or Turkish countries in the region, which are saying openly, look at what they are saying, we cannot abide by this. So with all that trust deficit, the U.S., by basically being caught in the middle here, is making it so that we have very little authority to exert over the conflict, which just means more uncertainty and more chaos and more prospect of war.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.